Hello and welcome to Continuing Clockwise, a channel about games, gamers, and gaming. I'm Chad. Today I'm going to talk about 4 concepts that came up during a Twitter conversation earlier this week. Mostly I'm going to be approaching it from a role-playing game perspective, but it also applies to other tabletop games and to video games. These concepts are mechanics, tactics and strategy, role-playing, and storytelling. The mechanics are the rules set in place for any specific game. This is what separates gaming from just people sitting around a campfire exchanging stories, or what separates games from other media such as movies or plays. On one end of the spectrum for mechanics are really simple games like tic-tac-toe or Candyland. Both have mechanics, both have rules, they're both games, but they're very light, as we all know. And then we have more complicated games, especially exception-based games like Magic the Gathering or Dungeons and Dragons, where the basic rules themselves aren't too complicated, but once you start adding the exceptions from the different character classes and all the different cards, it becomes really complicated, more complicated as all these different options appear. And at the furthest end of the spectrum are anything that Board Game Geek would rate as a weight of 5, such as Advanced Squad Leader. The other 3 concepts that I'm going to talk about emerge from the way the players, and in this case I'm including the Dungeon Master, interact with the mechanics of the game. The second, tactics, are the decisions and actions that players must make in order to achieve a specific intended outcome. And some game mechanics lend themselves to a lot of tactical play. Whether intentional or not, the players just need to make a lot of decisions in order to achieve their goals. Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition, for example, included a lot of rules for combat tactics in play. At the same time, it was entirely possible to play a non-tactical game of 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Nothing about the game itself required you to play tactically. That contrasts with war games or a lot of board games where you have to have some sort of tactical behavior if you're going to engage with the game at all, if you're going to play the game at all. Another thing to keep in mind, if you're playing a role-playing game like Dungeons & Dragons, if you're using a gridded playmat or something and miniatures, that in itself is encouraging tactical play. The third concept that we're going to talk about, role-playing. Role-playing is what individual players do in order to control and assume the personas of their individual character. A lot of this happens by speaking in the first person. Typically, it's a mix of first and third person interactions. At its most basic, anytime you're controlling a character in a game, you are role-playing. The spectrum here is very similar. So on one end of it, you've got moving the meeples in Candyland, which could be argued is the simplest kind of role-playing, all the way up to games where you stay in character and you're only making decisions based on what your character would know at any given time. Mechanics often will support role-playing, but they don't have to. Some games incentivize or even mandate specific kinds of role-playing. In previous editions of Dungeons & Dragons, for example, a paladin had to be lawful good, and they would lose many of their special abilities if they deviated from that path. As a result, if you're role-playing a paladin, you're very much incentivized to play your character in a very specific way and to role-play your character as the goody two-shoes. Experience points are another way that games incentivize certain kinds of behaviors in the characters. If the Dungeon Master is going to award experience points for slaying monsters and taking their loot, players are much more likely to slay monsters and take their loot. It doesn't require them to, but it's an incentive. There's another way that mechanics can actually suppress role-playing. If most of the mechanics have to do with tactical play, say, to pick on 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons again, the emphasis on combat in that game didn't explicitly suppress role-playing, but at least at my table, we would spend so much time and so much energy with these very tactical and intricate combats that just didn't leave a lot of energy and time for the role-playing. The role-playing wound up getting the leftovers. Last, and maybe most importantly, is storytelling. In the gaming world, the stories are what emerge from the interactions between the mechanics and all the players at the table. Again, this is what differentiates plays and movies from role-playing games. The players are not performing in the Dungeon Master's story. The DM's job is not to provide a story for the players. Instead, the DM is responsible for providing a setting, setting up challenges, laying over plot elements, and establishing other opportunities for the players to interact with the game and with each other and with the DM. And it's the result of all of that mixed together that the great stories emerge. So what do you think, DMs? Are you guilty of trying to micromanage the players into your story? What mechanics in 5th edition suppress or support role-playing and storytelling? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. As always, if you liked this video, please click the like button and consider subscribing to this channel. And you can follow me on Twitter if you'd like. Until next week, game great.